tech executive has reportedly been arrested for the stabbing murder of Cash App founder Bob Lee. Mission Local reports that the police were, quote, dispatched to Emeryville, California, with a warrant to arrest a man named Nima Momeni. The name and Emeryville address SVPD officers traveled to match the identity of the owner of another tech company called Expand IT. Law enforcement told Mission Local that Lee and the suspect were driving together in San Francisco on April 4th and, quote, some sort of confrontation ensued in the car and continued after Lee left the vehicle. The car was reportedly registered to the suspect.
Sources say that Lee was stabbed at least twice and that the murder weapon was recovered near the area where the stabbing occurred. So it appears they were traveling together and knew each other. And then at that point it becomes speculation that maybe some kind of argument or disagreement broke out. We don't know very much about Nima Momeni, the alleged killer. He is also in tech. We tried to look up what Expand IT does. It sounds pretty non-specific tech-type stuff.
It's tech stuff.
So anyway, he has been arrested. This is interesting because so Bob Lee left Silicon Valley, moved to Miami because of, he said this on the record, because of the crime concerns he had about what's happening in California. And then he was stabbed to death in Miami. So that people were pointing out to that, how ironic that is. And then, but it turns out, so this is not a random crime, the other way.
Right. So,
Excuse me, he was stabbed in San Francisco. He moved to Miami. He went back to San Francisco. Got stabbed.
So there has been a whole discourse since the murder of Bob Lee, about how people who have these concerns about the safety of San Francisco are completely vindicated, that there was a kind of like predictive value of his concerns, and that there was something, some kind of tragic not poetic justice, but like some tragic validation of his worldview here. Of course, the pushback has been, and this is from a CNN piece following the murder, that San Francisco, whatever you think about it, however it presents, has less violent crime and lower homicide rates than other cities of a similar size. This is just a big city issue. But all of that aside, whatever you think about the rightness or wrongness of assessments of San Francisco's crime rates,
it's not a random attack.
This was not a random attack. Yeah. So I do think there's going to be a number of people who are basically saying, I told you so in the wake of this tragic incident, that are going to have to retract their belief that this was a confirmation of their views about San Francisco's crime.
Well, I mean, it goes to show you should always wait for more facts before just opining. It's an odd situation, honestly, even as presented for a stabbing in a car involving people who know each other. So we'll have to learn obviously more about what went into this, who this guy is. It's, was there drugs involved? Was there a psychiatric issue, et cetera? But yes, it is interesting because of how much people pounced on the and the fact that he had left, and then so he was visiting, I think, for a work trip. He was back in the area, and it's very sad. He's married. He has young kids. I mean, obviously, murder sad anyway, but I know the family was very broken up about it. Horrific kind of death.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm trying to go back through and to see the kind of commentary that was happening about this before today. Michelle Tandler, a kind of conservative leading commentator who has been the focus of a lot of conversation this week because of a TikTok that she did, that's another story, tweeted out on April 7th that there's a disturbing crime wave has hit San Francisco this week. Tech leader Bob Lee was stabbed to death, cyclist Ethan Boyce was killed by a speeding car, and former fire commissioner Don Carmigiani was brutally beaten by homeless addicts. If this isn't a wake-up call, what will be? And that's very indicative of the tenor of a lot of the commentator. Now, of course, a lot of progressives, liberals are now saying, I told you so in the other direction, that, But this is a problem, I think, too often that people's anecdotal experiences are used to make broader claims about safety levels in cities. And I do think there's absolutely a proliferation of people who are unhomed. You saw it blossom, I think, at least in DC, during COVID. There were so many tents were everywhere, and it's very easy to use evidence of that as a correlation with broader crime trends, and sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. But I do think it's very easy to weaponize your individualized experiences, especially in urban environments where people are so concentrated, and you see so much more of what's going on in other people's lives than you do in rural or suburban environments, and then make political claims that don't necessarily pan out.
You know, to be clear, we should try to bring down the crime rate, the murder rate, regardless of everywhere, and regardless of if you're being attacked by random strangers or by people. I mean, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. A violent attack is a violent attack, whether it's someone you know, whether it's some random person, etc. So, you know, we need to know more about the circumstances that went into this.
Sure.
But it would be, ideally, we would bring down the crime rate, the violence rate, regardless. It's not really like, oh, well, it was known to him. It's still doesn't make any difference to him or his family.
Sure, of course.
I guess if people feel like it's less likely to happen to them.
That's the thing that causes people similarly. But I think that the opposite of that is exactly why there is this. You know, I'm trying to find a word that isn't a value judgment, because I think it's completely fair and legitimate to be concerned about violent crime wherever you live. But I do think that there is this. I got to say, as someone who grew up in a much less safe place, growing up overseas, spending a lot of time in Kenya where there were a lot of carjackings and kind of poverty-based crimes like that, when there's a huge income disparity between expats and the local population, stuff like that happens. My expectations of safety, I've noticed when I came back to the United States 6 months later, 9/11 happened. Like, my expectations of safety have always been different that I noticed from some of my American peers who've never been in a situation where you're kind of routinely on edge. And I'm not saying that's good. Obviously, it's not. I don't want people to live in a world where they're constantly on the lookout for carjackings and double, triple checking if their door is locked and speeding up through intersections, because, I mean, that is obviously not an ideal scenario. But I do sometimes think our relative safety here makes us very vulnerable to a certain kind of fear-mongering, because these things just aren't supposed to happen to me, which is also why these kind of instances of random violence like this are terrifying. You know, if someone who's rich and successful like Bob Lee can be murdered, what chance do I have? And then there is this kind of sick, sad relief when you realize it's an interpersonal dispute and not a broader trend. Well,
look, it used to be the case that you could, definitively, I mean, you can still say it. It's gotten a little bit more confusing. You could point to a time in the past, right? The violence rate, the gun violence rate in America from the period of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, all the way up into, like, the drop begins, it's very abrupt. It begins in, like, 1993. It was very high, and then there was an extreme decrease in the level of violence from the mid to late 90s through the aughts. And still, compared to where we were in the 80s and early 90s, we are way below that. So it used to be the case, but more definitively, that all the reporting about crime was missing the fact. Like, most people always thought crime was going up, when if you looked at statistics on a comparison to the world in which our parents and grandparents grew up, crime has dropped like 50%.
There was some interesting
massive reduction.
Potential causes. I mean, there was one 2022 study that said
air conditioning, lead.
7 to 28% of the fall in homicide rates could be attributed to just getting unleaded gasoline.
Yeah, that was a theory. Cities, there were some places where low-income people didn't have access to air conditioning until now. That's much more ubiquitous, and that literally cools tempers. Yes. It's wild to think through some of these things. With COVID, with various things in the last few years, it's not everywhere. Yeah. And it's again still nowhere close to where it was in Philadelphia. It is pretty bad. I've looked at the statistics. It's basically equivalent to where they were back then. But it's not true everywhere, so it's a little confusing. So we got to be careful how we describe these things. But in some ways, in some places, there has been an uptick in property crimes and violent crimes. Most places not anywhere near where it used to be in the 80s, although that's not true.
Yeah, well, now we know why they keep it so cool in this room,
Briahna
Robby.
Is so that you don't murder me?
Or vice versa.
Never. What would if I had to replace another host? No way. I'm glad to know that that's the reason why you're not going to murder me, Robby. More Rising right after this.